Good morning, everyone. My name is Sophie Louie. Thank you so much for joining us today. And happy first day of Asian Heritage Month. I hope that by joining with us today, you're going to kickstart a great month of honoring the diverse cultures within our Asian heritage here in Canada. And I thank you so much for joining us here today. I am delighted to be your moderator today for the leadership panel on anti-Asian racism and creating transformative change together. And I want to thank S.U.C.C.E.S.S for allowing me to be a part of this event. I should also just say off the top, as I said to the organizers before we started, I've been one of the lucky ones who has been able to continue going into my office. So while I do have some Zoom experience, it's not a lot, not as much as many people have had. So this is my first event that I've hosted live on any sort of video service. So please bear with me if I accidentally mute myself or turn off my camera. But hopefully we'll get through it all. I'd like to begin today by, of course, acknowledging the ancestral and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across the regions where we live and work. We express our gratitude and we honor the Indigenous peoples who are the keepers of these lands that have existed since time immemorial. S.U.C.C.E.S.S headquarters are on the unceded Coast Salish lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And if you would like to learn more about which land you are on, there is a website for that. It is native-land.ca, native-land.ca. I invite you to take a look. It's a really cool website. I believe it was actually developed here in BC initially, but it's sort of taken off and it shows traditional territories mapped throughout the world. So it's definitely worth a visit. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the Indigenous peoples, as I mentioned, for being keepers of this land and allowing us to work and play and live on it. As I mentioned, today's panel is organized by S.U.C.C.E.S.S, and S.U.C.C.E.S.S would like to thank Raymond James Limited, who is the presenting sponsor and generous supporter, allowing us to increase accessibility of this event through ASL interpretation. Liz and Melanie are the ASL interpreters for today. Thank you very much, Liz and Melanie, and we'd like to recognize and thank them for being here with us. We would now like to introduce our national panel of leaders for today's discussion. They are the Honourable Bardish Chagger, Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth. The Honourable Mary Ng, Minister of Small Business, Export Promotion and International Trade. The Honourable Hedy Fry, Member of Parliament for Vancouver Centre, where I live. The Honourable Yuen Wu, Senator from BC. The Honourable Bowinn Ma, Minister of State for Infrastructure. Nikki Sharma, Parliamentary Secretary for Community Development and Nonprofits. Rachna Singh, Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives. Nadine Nakagawa, Councillor for the City of New Westminster. And Steve Kim, Councillor for the City of Coquitlam. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us this morning. Now, before we go any further, we do want to set the context for our discussion today. Although today's topic of discussion is anti-Asian racism, we of course recognize that Asian communities are not the only communities being harmed by racism and hate. We know that. In particular, Black and Indigenous communities have long experienced oppression in Canada. It's important for all of us to build solidarity against all forms of racism and hate, regardless of which community is being targeted. Racism against one group is racism against all. It hurts all of us. Anti-Asian racism is not a new phenomenon in Canada. Throughout history, we've seen numerous examples of racism against Asian communities. For example, the Chinese head tax, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the anti-Asian riots of 1907, The Komagata Maru incident, the internment of Japanese people, and various acts that have denied and excluded Asian communities from participating in Canadian society. What's happening during the COVID-19 pandemic is just a continuation of this long history of oppression, exclusion, and marginalization. And I'm sure you've heard many of the horrifying stories of people of Asian heritage being targeted throughout this pandemic here in Vancouver and across Canada and North America. Statistics we've seen this past year demonstrate just how common this theme has become. In April, Insights West released the results from their survey that found 43% of Asian British Columbians, 43% have experienced racism this past year, including racial slurs, discrimination at work and school, property damage, and assault. It shouldn't shock me, but I guess it still does surprise me that it continues in 2021. Just a few weeks ago, Burnaby RCMP shared that they saw a 350% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. And I'm sure you've heard this statistic before. Earlier this year, the Vancouver Police Department shared that they saw a 717% increase in anti-Asian hate crime from 2019 to 2020. It's also important to recognize community organizations like Project 1907 and the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, along with the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter and Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, who've been working tirelessly to collect data on the prevalence of anti-Asian incidents across Canada. They have found there were 1,150 incidents of racist attacks reported from March 2020 to February 2021, of which 44% were here in BC. The numbers are obviously alarming, but we recognize a lot of people don't even report racist and hateful incidents, and so the true number is likely much higher. There's a good chance that you have a family member or a friend, a coworker, or a neighbor who has been on the receiving end of anti-Asian racism over the past year. There is an urgent need to take action to move forward and create transformative change. Together, we have to strive for an equitable, safe, and inclusive Canada for everyone. So today's panel discussion is just a small part of that, of this tremendous amount of work that we still have to do. So for this event, we've divided up our panelists into 3 groups. Each group will take on one important discussion question. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, just one question, but this is a very big topic and we want to give them time to really have a good discussion. Now, at the end, we will invite each panelist to provide some final thoughts based on what they've heard today. So to discuss our first question, we will have Minister Mary Ng, Parliamentary Secretary Rachna Singh, and Councillor Steve Kim. So let's get started. As I mentioned earlier, we've heard many stories almost daily about individual experiences of racism and hate. Many of the incidents were already occurring prior to the pandemic. There's a greater awareness right now about the severity of anti-Asian racism in Canada. Each of you come from the federal, provincial, or municipal government. The discussion question for this group is, how do we shift from awareness of the problem toward more tangible actions by all levels of government? How can your 3 levels of government work together for a more coordinated approach to anti-racist solutions? So we know it exists. How do we tackle it with real action now? So I'd like to invite each of our 3 panelists to provide an initial 3-minute response, and then afterward, we'll have a brief discussion on what you've just heard. And we'll start with Minister Mary Ng. Mary?
Thank you so much, Sophie, and it's terrific to be here with my colleagues and all levels of government who are here so that we can actually have this really important conversation about what we might lay the track for in terms of the future. And thank you to S.U.C.C.E.S.S, which is just an incredible community organization that is bringing us all together to have this conversation. Over the last, certainly you're absolutely right, Sophia. I mean, to see the numbers is one thing, but to hear on a regular basis, whether they are your friends or, in my case, my constituents, or people who you know share stories that affect them. So whether it is a friend whose mother is 70 years old in Vancouver who sends him a text and says, you know, son, how do I get some pepper spray because I'm going to go out for a walk today? Or a colleague whose family has been here for 120 years as Canadians, and recently at a grocery store was shoved aside and essentially blamed for COVID-19, or the countless roundtables that Minister Chagger and I and some of our colleagues and MP Fry have convened across the country, and hearing the real experiences from people. So hearing the experiences and seeing the numbers, there's no question it's alarming. But the question really is the question you're asking is, what do we do? And maybe the best way to answer it, I will try to paraphrase what I've been hearing from those very people. And when I hear from them and what they are suggesting for us to take some action, it really actually does fall in we all have a little something to do. So at the federal level, of course, and Minister Chagger will likely get into this a little bit more, but we just released a federal budget where, in response to so much of what we've been hearing around the country, the need to tackle racism, and certainly anti-Asian racism, has resulted in now an $11 million investment in this year's budget, so that we can bring together community groups and those that can help in this in the doing something to tackle anti-Asian racism. But here are some of the other things that we've been hearing across the country. We hear from leaders and from community leaders that education has a role in terms of the curriculum and how we might be able to provide better education or better opportunities for that kind of awareness through the curriculum. So that, of course, is very much an area that the province looks at. We've been doing these roundtables and actually have also included law enforcement as a listener in some of these roundtables, Bardish and I. And so Minister Blair, who is our federal colleague responsible for public safety, and convening law enforcement, and there as a participant in listening to what the issues are, whether they be reporting or whether it is, what do we need to do together to create safer streets and safer opportunities? So that is both an area of all areas of responsibility, including at the city level. So I think you're going to tell me to stop, but
I am going to tell you your time's up. Yeah. But education,
we can all do something, and there is something definitely for all of us to do.
Okay, well, we'll give you a chance to talk a little bit more in just a couple of minutes, but I want to move to our next panelist, and that is Parliamentary Secretary Rachna Singh. Rachna?
Thank you so much, Sophie, and it's so glad to be here joining you from the shared territories of Kwantlen, Kwikpetlam, Ketsi, Sami-Emu, and Swasan First Nations. And I think this is a very, very important conversation. I really would like to thank S.U.C.C.E.S.S and Queenie Chu for organizing this. For the last 1 year, we have heard so many stories. And I would say my meeting with Queenie, when she was telling me about the incidents that they are hearing at the S.U.C.C.E.S.S, the victim story, those are very saddening. But one thing that, Sophie, that you touched upon, that systemic racism has always existed in Canada. And that is what we really need to touch upon, whether it is our historical wrongs or what has happened with our Indigenous populations and is still happening in this age and time. We are in 2021. These are not the things that we should be talking about, but this is a reality. And I'm glad a lot of times what has happened is that we take racism as an elephant in the room. We don't want to talk about it. And with the multiculturalism, it has done really good things in Canada, but it has in some way tried to portray Canada in a way, though everything is fine, we are doing well. And I think that has created some problems. We have the kind of racism that we experience here. It is like the polite form of racism. We always try to say, it is Canada is not US, it is everything bad is happening south of the border. So I'm glad for these conversations, for creating these spaces where we can talk about it, making space where we are comfortable talking about racism. And I would say from the provincial level, my appointment for the first time ever in British Columbia as a parliamentary secretary for anti-racism, recognizing that racism, not just individual racism, but that systemic racism exists, and we need to take very concrete steps to tackle it. What we have done with our starting our Resilience BC network, that is our anti-racism network, reinstating Human Rights Commission, which was, we were the only province for 15 years that did not have it. And that's why we lacked that education that needed to be imparted. We were lacking that in British Columbia. And also what the mandate letter that Premier John Horgan has given to all the cabinet, my cabinet colleagues, all the parliamentary secretary, to look at their work from the anti-racist lens. Also, you will do with the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. I know we need to put in steps. As we just announced yesterday, we are creating a hotline to report racist incidents. That is very important. As you mentioned, a lot of incidents are reported, but a lot of people don't even feel safe, don't feel comfortable even reporting those incidents. So creating that culturally sensitive space for them is very important, and we are looking into it. But these are, I would say, these are the reactive responses, but like something that we have to bring into the system, a proactive approach, creating a legislation, and I'll talk more about it in my next part.
Sure. All right. Thank you very much, Rachna. If I do this, if you guys see me hold up my finger, I'll just give you a 1 minute because they're giving me a cue in the chat box next to these screens. So thank you very much, Rachna. And we'll move on. Same question for Councillor Kim. Steve?
Well, thank you very much. And I would like to start with my acknowledgement that I'm joining everyone today from the unceded traditional territory of the Coquitlam and Coast Salish peoples. And I'd also like to quickly thank our hosts for the event. And I'm so honored to join the incredible panel of speakers here today. The increase in anti-Asian racism, speech, and violence is certainly very concerning. And sadly, our city is not immune. So this issue is very near and dear to me. So to the questions, how do we shift to action? And we know that this is a very expansive question, but I've tried to capture a few points. Firstly, as government, we need, as we do with all actions, we need a plan that aims to improve the current systems. We also need the resources and the people to execute the plan. For example, Coquitlam is now working on our own diversity, equity, inclusion strategy, which is an A priority for this year. And to me, I think that's very important that we prioritized it in such a way. To me, part of this review is to include a meaningful look in the mirror and see how our systems can improve. But also, this strategy should serve as a key component in all we do as a city and across our community, not act as some ad hoc strategy that comes as an afterthought. Secondly, we must commit to prompt action when incidents occur. I was very pleased to see our Ministry of Transportation, I believe, they responded recently to some hateful graffiti in a very timely manner that was on one of their bridges, if I remember correctly. Hate must be stamped out immediately as they occur. Thirdly, over the long term, I also believe that we must increase representation, not just elected officials, but also staff, so that our governments have more diverse experiences and points of view at the table. Next, and I know that this is a forum on government, but as elected officials and politicians, we have to strive to remove politics of fear and division. I think that's also a key component. In terms of coordinating together, at the end of the day, we need better communication with all levels of government. I'm also very encouraged to see all stakeholders such as media, Sophie, yourself with your special, education, also business and nonprofits all working together. And we all need to create a united front so that we're all lockstep in our efforts together. But I will end with this. I also suggest a commitment from all of us here today to build on this dialogue to work on action. And this might be, I don't know, in the form of a working group, a task force, whatever it might be, but this is just a tip of the iceberg. And hopefully with the digital world that we're in, we can really find an efficient way to approach this, but let's get to work.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve. So now is the time that we have to sort of discuss what we've just heard. And Mary, I know I sort of cut you off earlier, so I'll get back to you right away to let you finish your thought and sort of respond to what we've just heard.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's actually terrific, Sophie. That's exactly what you should be doing so that we can actually all get through this. But picking up on the point that Steve made, I really do think that that committing and to take concrete action, one that includes government, but all of our other partners, whether it is the not-for-profit sector, private sector, and Canadians. And you know, where I started in my remarks was really very much about what I've been hearing from people across the country who have either experienced or are concerned about anti-Asian racism and have already put forward some ideas about what it is that we could be doing. And as I said, they sort of sit in not one jurisdiction, they in fact sit in all of our jurisdictions. So I think that that if we have an outcome out of a conversation that we begin today, it really means the work that you are doing, Coquitlam, that we are doing at the federal level, and that Rachna, you are doing in one province. You know, there really is that opportunity to get concrete and to drive to some action that really will be meaningful and demonstrable for the people to whom we all serve, which are Canadians.
Rachna, you talked a lot about polite forms of racism, and I think a lot of Canadians would agree that's sort of how we sort of sweep it under the rug, pretend it doesn't exist, but it really does.
Yeah, no, and I'm so glad. I'm really thankful to Mary and Steve for their comments. And this is, Sophie, this is what I've always felt like in the last few years, especially what was with the Donald Trump and the rhetoric that was happening south of the border. Sometimes when we try to bring about the white supremacy happening here in Canada, a lot of people would say, especially I come from Surrey, which is like very ethnic, very diverse, racialized population that we have here. And hearing from my own community saying that, no, racism does not exist. We have done very well. A lot of times these people did not even have the capacity to recognize racism. They are working 2 or 3 jobs sometime. And also, first of all, not able to recognize it. And then even if you recognize it, not have the capacity to speak up against it. So that's why when I said about a platform, like when you create those spaces for people to be able to talk about, first of all, to recognize, and also asking other people not just to be silent bystanders. I think that is very important. The words really matter. I was really happy when last year, Prime Minister Trudeau, when he talked about systemic racism in our society. I think that is very important coming from our leadership. Our Premier John Horgan has said the same about the systemic racism in our system. And that's what gives people people think that this is not just me, this is not my personal thing, it is just what is happening in the system, giving them the opportunity to speak about it. Mm-hmm. And also a very collaborative approach. It is not just the governments. Yes, governments have the responsibility, it is their duty to bring in the policy work. But I think we won't be able to do it without our strong allies. And what like our community partners, like what S.U.C.C.E.S.S is doing today, or what you in your role in the media, you do every day in creating that awareness. I think that is very important. No change has come ever in the society without the help of without the collaboration of the civil society. And I think we have to take them hand in hand and go when we move towards the policy. It is in collaboration with them, in consultation with that when we develop that policy, because it should work for those people. It should be working at the grassroots level, that policy.
Steve, I just want to touch on something you talked about too, that and Rachna mentioned this as well, that you should be approaching all of the work that you do in your various levels of government through the lens of anti-racism. So whether it's whatever project the city of Coquitlam might be working on, there should be some thought given to anti-racism. So talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and thank you for that. It's something For instance, in my previous life, when I was in communications and digital marketing was coming into play, no one thought to put a budget for digital marketing, and yet now suddenly it's the biggest budget that you might have for marketing. And you see it as a pretty important component of any strategy that you would look to implement. So when I think about what a DEI strategy could be, it's one where fundamentally during the strategy research and planning phase, you're seeing an element of that, so that down the line, you know that you put in the work to really understand how that will impact any type of strategy that you create. And that would be across departments. So to bring it back to the example, today, again, a digital marketing campaign is probably integral in any strategy and any operational plan that they might have. So, to me, some heavy lifting at the beginning, I believe will have a much more positive impact down the line. So I think it's a fundamental building block.
Right. Mary and Rachna talked about the Prime Minister acknowledging systemic racism, the Premier acknowledging systemic racism. The importance of having our leaders acknowledge that it exists. I mean, people within our own communities, as I think Rachna had also said, don't even realize it exists. They don't want to admit it, or they just don't know. It's something you live with your whole life, I've found, and it doesn't occur to you that there is any other way. So how important is it for our leaders to acknowledge this?
That's a very important question. I think it's very important. It is why the Prime Minister has spoken out about it. It is precisely why I and others who have the opportunity to serve in leadership roles in our jobs to be able to speak about it. And you too as well, Sophie. I mean, when the media is able to bring about the awareness to Canadians and enable there to be a platform for Canadians to begin to have the conversations. One interview I did recently, they asked me the question, well, what can we do? And I said, well, everyone can do something. If you are a mom, you do not want to see your child be bullied in the schoolyard. Well, that is what's happening to an Asian child. So teach your children, help them be a part of the solution. If you are a bystander and you are seeing someone being bullied or worse, hurt, then do something, act. And I do think it is leaders, but it is all Canadians, it is families, and it is media. It is those of us who have an opportunity to have a public platform, to use that public platform in such a way that brings about the awareness, and the awareness brings conversations. The conversations bring us to change, and that is so that's why it's important.
All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you for going first as well. It's always toughest going first. We'll get you to sit tight, and we'll be coming back to you a little bit later after we talk to our other panelists. But thank you so much for your thoughtful answers. And I agree, conversation is key to trying to move forward and having those tough conversations with ourselves as well internally about our own actions and our own thoughts. So I appreciate your time. All right, we will move on to our next group of panelists, who are Dr. Hedy Fry, Senator Yuen and Minister Bowinn Ma. Canada has always been proud of its stated commitments to multiculturalism. For many, it's a core part of their Canadian identity and values. In reality, though, we continue to witness racism at individual and systemic levels. The discussion questions for this group are, what can a modernized version of multiculturalism look like so that it is anti-racist and rooted in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion for everyone? Can this help to dismantle systems that continue to perpetuate oppression and reinforce exclusion? I would like to invite our three panelists to provide an initial 3-minute response, as you just saw, and afterward we will talk about what we've just heard. And again, maybe I'll do this sort of 1 minute. You can see my finger when I'm given the 1 minute cue. You have 1 minute, and then I'll start to interrupt you. All right, let's start with Hedy Fry. Hedy, what can a modernized version of multiculturalism look like?
Well, I'm going to preface it by just giving you a little historical context of multiculturalism. I was a minister for multiculturalism for almost 7 years under the Chrétien government. And the multiculturalism is not just something we like to think we do. Multiculturalism actually is informed by an act that decides what it was about. And what really multiculturalism started as, when it was thought of as an idea as opposed to now informed by an act, was that it wanted everyone to have an inclusive society where people understood each other, got to know each other, felt had some form of tolerance for each other. And I'm using those words specifically. As we moved on further, but the important thing was that under the Multiculturalism Act, you had to actually do disaggregated data. This was a big piece of what I did. I worked very closely with Statistics Canada because you had to identify all of the differences, because there are people who suffer from racism because of visible minorities. There are those who are invisible minorities, like ethnic groups that suffer from racism and are discriminated against, except you don't know it. And then, of course, we looked at Indigenous people. So the Act talked actually very clearly about being able to ensure that people in the country, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, language, culture, and Indigenous status, were able to participate fully in the economic, social, political, and cultural life of the country. You couldn't do that unless you had disaggregated data. The data informed you about those who were able to and those who weren't participating. And so we unearthed a whole lot of things that showed us what was wrong, and we were able to attach it. Now, where's a modern, my role was to make sure that in the third wave of multiculturalism, we had to get to know each other. And I think we need to talk about where we go from here. And Sophie, you've given me your one finger thing. Okay. I can come back to this later on to see how we build on what we had started, which fell off the grid for 10 years.
Oh, you still have a minute, Hedy. You can keep going.
Okay. Well, 10 years later, multiculturalism became something in which we just gave people money just to have festivals. And we didn't look at the substantive of how we change our institutions, our systems. And I think that is what we're talking about right now. And I'd like to jump onto that when we get to the second round of this discussion.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Hedy. If only the other anchors at Global took time cues as well as you do. All right, we'll move on then to Senator Yuen Wu. Senator Wu.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, S.U.C.C.E.S.S and colleagues for this terrific event. I think the single most important advance in multiculturalism, in a modern multiculturalism for Canada, is to move beyond the diversity of colors and ethnicity and racial or linguistic backgrounds to also encompass and embrace cognitive diversity. The point of having different backgrounds in our society, indeed in leadership positions in our society, is surely not simply to have different colors around the table or different national origins, but to bring about the different ideas and perspectives and knowledge that come embedded with the folks who represent the different backgrounds. It wouldn't be very helpful for us to have a superficially multicultural leadership class if the ideas were all of the one mind. And that, of course, brings up the whole question of why we are in this predicament today, where we saw a sharp spike in anti-Asian racism, even though we know that anti-Asian racism has been around for a long time. And part of the problem, part of the reason, which we really have to face up to, is that it was precipitated, triggered by false information, wrong narratives that we haven't even addressed yet today, but we have to directly attack And that means allowing for the cognitive diversity to challenge these conventional wisdoms that precipitated, accelerated, and weaponized anti-Asian racism, as we've seen in the last 18 months.
Wow. 2 minutes. You only took 2 minutes, but we'll get back to you, Senator Wu.
I'll claim it back later. Rest assured. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. We move next to Bowinn Ma. Bowinn.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And I really appreciated being able to hear MP Fry and Senator Wu's comments ahead of time. And it strikes me that when we're talking about a modernized form of multiculturalism, taking into context what MP Fry talked about in terms of how the multiculturalism file started, I do agree with her that we've moved away from that somehow. And multiculturalism in recent years has seemed to become more about diversity and celebrating differences, which is so important, but it's not the same as anti-racism. And we need both multiculturalism and anti-racism at the same time, in addition to education, so that we are enabling an understanding of history and the intergenerational impacts of that context. So this is something that I really appreciated about the appointment of Rachna Singh in our government to Parliamentary Secretary of Anti-Racism. Governments in recent years have been quite good about appointing parliamentary secretaries or ministers of state or people to represent the multiculturalism file. But that is, like I said, very different from anti-racism. Mm-hmm. And as an anti-racism file that Rachna Singh now has, it encompasses a much more challenging conversation than multiculturalism has become. Multiculturalism, generally speaking, I think is no longer as difficult of a conversation as anti-racism is. And the reason why that's important to recognize is that multiculturalism on its own risks becoming tokenization. And Senator Yu spoke a little bit about that tokenization of like kind of getting the right colors in the mix and so forth. Anti-racism on its own with nothing else risks becoming erasure for non-dominant cultures. And historic context on its own, while very helpful, doesn't necessarily allow us to move forward together. But together, you have multiculturalism that helps people appreciate and understand the differences of other cultures. You have anti-racism to help people understand and recognize oppressive behavior. And that could be individual behavior, it can also be behavior on a system-wide level. And historical context for why some people experience, why some people with certain experiences do need additional supports and consideration to help overcome what's happened to them, to their families, their people, and how that impacts people today in our society today. We need all three if we want to be able to move towards a future that ensures everyone receives that equal respect, regardless of where they come from and what they look like.
So how do we, and now we'll go back to Hedy and Senator Wu as well, but how do we then bring those initiatives together? Like, have we, because we're so proud of our multiculturalism in Canada, have we used that somehow as a
shield?
Yeah, as a shield to say we're not racist. We love everyone. We celebrate everyone's festivals, etc. If we manage to escape past anti-racism, it's really just a discussion that's come up only in the past few years. I'll go back to Hedy. Oh, you're muted, Hedy.
Look, I think we have to decide what the objective here is. I don't think we should discard multiculturalism. Your question is how to create a modern multicultural system. I mean, because the objective of multiculturalism has always been to create an inclusive society in which everyone was able to participate fully in the economic, social, political, and cultural life of the nation. Now, you have to first, to create a new system, you have to collect disaggregated data so you can see whether everybody is indeed participating. And if they're not, find out why. So you got to tunnel all the way down and ensure that they get the skills and tools they need to overcome the barriers. And that means that we're going to have to work at 3 levels of government together. When I was a minister, every province had a multiculturalism minister. That is no longer so. And now what we're focusing on is racism per se. So we are just looking at the problem and we're not looking at the solution. And the solution needs, first and foremost, to educate the public. Now, I wanted to just take a minute to say, the Asian population, both the Sikhs and the Chinese and the Japanese, have been here for over 135 years in this province. Nobody knows that. Everybody thinks they just got off a plane or a boat. So we need to educate the history of the peoples who came here and built this nation. It's about building an inclusive nation. That's what the objective should be. And so what we need to do is educate the public. I used to do certain clips that went on to Air Canada and you were forced to watch it. They were half-an-hour clips that was called The Gathering of Seeds. There were 52 of them. And those clips showed you people coming to Canada, struggling, facing discrimination, but staying and building a nation. And that gave people a sense of the history of the peoples who came here and the Indigenous peoples. So the first thing we need to do is educate. Second thing, we don't have the ability, but in the province they have, to build school curriculums that say what that history is. So when you sit next to a Sikh kid in class, you know that his parents came here 135 years ago and that he didn't just arrive. So there is respect you want to build for each other and the people who've helped to build the nation that we now have, flawed though it is. The final thing we need to do, provinces can work with businesses, federation can work with federally regulated businesses, and we need to do institutional change, police, law, judiciary, armed forces, the civil service. We need to dig down into those institutions, make them welcoming, make them inclusive, not just inclusive, but welcoming, encouraging everyone to join and participate. And that includes Parliament and how we get everybody to be included in it. And finally, help NGOs like S.U.C.C.E.S.S to have the tools and the funds that they need to build at the community level. So that's my vision of a modern multiculturalism system.
Okay, I want to go back to Bowinn then, because you did bring up action that the province can take. And, you know, I think each level of government has its own very specific areas where they can focus. Bowinn, what did you think of Hedy's comments? And, you know, it's been a long time since I was in public school, but there is a lot that I don't recall being taught in the provincial curriculum way back then. Perhaps it's different now.
Yeah, I think that Hedy, I mean, a lot of what you said about education, I completely agree with. Like, we have to understand, like what I mentioned in my earlier statements, we have to understand the historical context that has brought these people, all Canadians and Indigenous people, together on these lands. And when we talk about historical context in education, it also means understanding things like the residential school system and why that impacts Indigenous populations today. When I went to public school, I did not learn any of this. I'm 35, turning 36 this year. I would have gone in through public school through kind of the 90s and early 2000s. And I did not learn that kind of historical context for how Canada was treating Indigenous people. And it was something that I had to learn as an adult in my late 20s. Today, folks who are older than me are far less likely to have received that type of education as people who are younger than me. People who are younger than me know it very well because it has entered into our public schools. So absolutely, that makes a lot of sense, and it absolutely is something that we need to do. But if you don't mind, Sophie, I'd also like to touch on one of your earlier questions, which was, does Canada's multiculturalism pride get in the way of our ability to actually see the challenges that we're facing as a country? And I would say, yes, it does. I did not understand racism until I was older. And in fact, I started to really understand it as an elected official, watching how the people that I serve were being treated differently. And also because, frankly, members of the public are quite frank with elected officials in a way that
one way to put it.
But I mean, growing up, of course there was racism, but I didn't necessarily understand that that's what it was that I was experiencing or what my parents were experiencing. It wasn't until I was older that I started to be able to understand and have the language to be able to talk about it. I think that the kind of work and the kind of discussions we're having today on this panel through the various pods is so incredibly important, in part because it enables us to be able to articulate some of the anti-race, or pardon, the racist behaviors that we're seeing, and some of the anti-racist behaviors that we need to be actively putting out.
And I'm with you, Bowinn. I went through racist incidents growing up, but I don't think it really occurred to me how deeply entrenched it is in our society until becoming an adult and going to work, and that's where I discovered the systems that we work within, that we live within, have those deeply entrenched racist and sexist backgrounds to them. We are almost out of time for this group, but I want to give the last word to Senator Wu. And one of the things that I thought you brought up, Senator Wu, that was really interesting while we talk about being able to articulate more about anti-racism and multiculturalism, you talked about cognitive diversity. So really going beyond just the color of one's skin and being tokenized, as Bowinn had mentioned earlier.
Well, yeah, I mean, otherwise, what's the point of having different backgrounds in a group, in a society? But we know that Asian Canadians are often systematically excluded from leadership positions in our country. There are studies which show that the same CV using a Chinese name or using a Western name will yield a much better result if it's the Western name. These are double-blind studies, that produce such results. So multiculturalism has taken us a long way. It's become a totem for our country. It shouldn't be an ideology. It's a statement of our reality. We have a multicultural society, but that's not going to get us out of the anti-racism mess that we're in. Mm-hmm. That's going to require much harder work. It's going to require all the things that the previous panelists have talked about. But above all, it's going to require a willingness on the part of, if I can call it mainstream society, to accept that having someone from a different background on your board or in your school or in your parliament means having to listen to a view that's going to be different.
Yes.
And can you take it? Can you take it?
Yeah.
But if you cannot take it, then you haven't crossed the threshold.
It's got to be more than just ticking the box of we have this color person or this color person on our board or committee or whatever.
And I would say it's also about accepting different accents, different ways of speaking. We're very snobbish about, look, I speak a certain kind of English, which is probably very acceptable to all of you. But many of my Chinese friends and Korean friends and Japanese friends speak a kind of English that it's not pure. Mm-hmm. But what's wrong with that? If the ideas are good, but we're very, very discriminatory about those kinds of things. Never mind spellings of names and so on.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much to all three of you. We will, as I mentioned with the last panel, get back to you when we wrap up. But for now, I'll ask you to sit tight and enjoy our next panel. And for that final group of panelists, we have Minister Bardish Chagger, Parliamentary Secretary Nikki Sharma, and Councillor Nadine Nakagawa. And for your group, systemic racism oppresses not only Asian Canadians, but all racialized groups, particularly Indigenous and Black communities. The model minority myth, which we've heard a lot about this past year, creates and maintains division among groups that have been marginalized and excluded, which draws attention away from the need to confront the problem of white supremacy. In order to address anti-Asian racism, we cannot exclude the historical and current experiences of other racialized communities. The discussion question for this group is, what role can government play to support communities to build and foster solidarity against white supremacy while working collaboratively to address systemic racism? And just like our first two panel groups, I would invite each of our three panelists to provide an initial 3-minute response. I will do the 1-minute warning for you, but you can always go shorter if you want, and we'll take it up on the other end. And then afterwards, we'll discuss what you've all just heard. So we'll start this one off with Minister Bardish Chagger. Bardish?
Thank you, Sophie. And I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe neutral people. And I think it's important that we take time to acknowledge the land, because to have that vision of an even better and consciously more inclusive Canada, we have to know where we come from. And the reality is that we don't really know our history since Confederation, let alone pre-Confederation. And I know this personally because I became the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth, traveled to Nova Scotia, and got to meet African Nova Scotians who have been here over 400 years, well before Confederation. But I wasn't taught that in school. And everyone cannot become a cabinet minister to learn this. And that's really where the foundation of my work comes from, is actually looking at our government's goal since we took office in 2015 to actually confront and address racism and discrimination in all of its forms, so that each Canadian can be their true authentic self and contribute. And that's how our entire country will succeed. So we launched the Foundation for Change, Canada's anti-racism strategy, which includes 3 pillars. So your question, what can government do? Government can take a role, and they have to choose to take a role and play an active role. So the 3 pillars of the strategy: first of all, federal leadership. We are there at the table. Second, empowering communities. I always say empowering and enabling communities. And that means investing in those communities, because those communities know very well what is needed. And that's the approach that our government's taking. And the third pillar is changing attitudes through education. And that actually provides the federal government a branch into working with provinces and territories so that we actually can be in this all together. COVID-19 has demonstrated when all levels of government work well together, we can achieve anything we put our minds to. And I think that is really important to Canadians, because they want to see us working better together. They don't want to see us fighting. They just want to see us address the challenges that they are facing in regards to, and so the COVID-19 pandemic has not created these inequities, it's just exposed them. So we really have this opportunity to see what can we do. And I would just say, in regards to white supremacy, in 2019, our government was the first one to actually put white supremacist groups on the terrorist list. And most recently, this year in February, we added Proud Boys to the terrorist group, amongst others. So part of it is confronting it based on evidence. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. We have to confront it. We have to address it in a meaningful way and then take actions. So I look forward to my next opportunity. But our government's goal under this Prime Minister is not to be less racist than other countries, but to be the most anti-racist country in the world. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that, Bardish. And we'll move on to Nikki Sharma now. Nikki?
Hi, I just want to say thank you for inviting me here. It's so great to be here with all you esteemed panelists and listen to everybody, and coming to you from the traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. I wanted to just add the responsibility of government in this and just focus on that. I'm so grateful that the question included the term white supremacy, because we were hiding from that term for a very long time. I did some research recently with the work I was doing with government about BC's history. There was a time in our history where the white population was a minority. And so what that meant was actual government action, very consolidated, very focused for white supremacy. So many pieces of legislation, so many things that happened in our legislature that I'm now a part of that raised white supremacy. So as an elected official now, I am keenly aware of my role and every government's role when it comes to dismantling that. Just to pick up the words of anti-racism. So to me, what that means is reaching into every ministry that set up the system that we now have today and finding out how it oppresses, how it pulls down people, how it's created the structures of oppression that people face, and dismantling it, changing it. And that's the power of government in this, because, you know, to a large extent, government created a lot of the problems, and we have to confront that. We have to face it. And so the work of anti-racism in our government is everybody's responsibility. Every minister, my role as parliamentary secretary to support the nonprofits that are working in that area. but I just don't think we can step away from that responsibility and focus on things that are not central to our role in creating racism in our society. And I am hopeful. When I research and I think of the stories of the oppression that government had in our province, you always find people in the community that were fighting back, showed up to MLAs like myself at that point and said, this is wrong. We should have the right to vote. We should have the right to have property. Our rights should be recognized. And that's also the power of British Columbians. And it keeps us all going when we think about that. And I know that's a lot of people out there today that are now fighting anti-Asian racism that's reared its ugly head in this terrible way at this point. So, we stand together and we have more diversity in government than ever before, the people that have lived experiences that can bring that to the table. So I'm always hopeful with the power of that kind of change. And I ended early there, so.
That's okay, you can use it up on the other end. Thank you, Nikki. And we'll move on to Nadine Nakagawa now. Nadine?
Well, I'm so happy that I got this question. Actually, this is exactly what I wanted to talk about. So I'm on the unceded territory of the Hunkaminam speaking people. And New West is a really colonial city. We're the royal city. What does it mean to be governing on unceded territory? I mean, I think that's being in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, deeply contemplating that. A lot of us are on unceded territory and are still sitting in roles of power and making decisions. We also have to address equity issues. So communities are not monolithic, and we have to talk about that it's not the same to be racialized as it is to be racialized and poor. It's not the same to be a woman of color and to be a disabled woman of color. So we have to complexify the way that we're thinking about race. Gender, poverty, socioeconomic status, all of that deeply matters. So we have to look at equity-based policies. It's also the elephant in the room that we have to talk about public safety. I think it was brought up in an earlier conversation, calls about addressing changes to policing right now. That's what it means to me to be in solidarity with communities. When we're talking about anti-Asian racism, we're often talking about individual acts. An elder gets pushed, people are called names. That is very, very different than systemic racism. Asians face systemic racism as well. But when we talk about addressing those individual acts of racism, we often talk about calling the police. But knowing that policing makes Indigenous and Black communities less safe, we have to be in solidarity when we're talking about that. And we have to be bringing our communities along in that conversation. Mm-hmm. It also means to me addressing things like drug prohibition, which inordinately affect Black and Indigenous communities, child apprehension, people living in poverty. So for me, anti-racist poverty is transit policy. It is also raising social development and disability rates. It's having housing policy that works for different communities, intergenerational families. It's healthcare that is culturally appropriate and culturally safe. So it is all those very specific systemic changes. I also just want to name that white supremacy and colonialism are tied up with capitalism. They're deeply tied up with our economic system. So at some point, we do also have to have that conversation as well.
All right, thank you, Nadine. And you all sort of went a little bit under your time, or pretty close anyway. So we've got a little extra time, which is great. So I'll circle back to Bardish Chagger now for your thoughts on what you just heard, Bardish. You also talked about education, which has been mentioned earlier, and I think which is something that needs to be taken into account, obviously, when it comes to our public school system. We talked about that with Bowinn, but what about how do we educate those of us who are long past the school system and convince people that there is still education to be had?
I think it's actually a greater conversation because education is lifelong. So it's not a matter of I didn't learn it when I was younger. I'm still in the journey. I don't know what I don't know, but I do know that I want to do better and I want to be better. And the way for me to do that is by broadening my horizons. One question I constantly ask now is when we make a decision, who's informing this decision? What does the decision-making table look like? Who's being represented? Who's not being represented? Because if the same 36 people who negotiated Confederation continue negotiating the way we move our ways forward, nothing will change. You can't use the same systems and hope for a different outcome. I'm a woman in science. I know better than that. And I think that's to Dr. Fry's point in regards to desegregated data. You can't measure what you don't know. And that's where, if you now saw in the pandemic, StatsCan came out with disaggregated data when it came to employment numbers. So what are we talking about? We're talking about women in the workforce. We're talking about the intersectionalities of who had the greatest consequences of this pandemic. We have a childcare strategy, early learning and childcare strategy. And that early learning component is the most exciting part for me, because it doesn't matter what family you're born in or where you are, you're going to have the equal footing in life to be able to succeed. And I think that's where, you'll see like the commercial and people have overseen it, racism is learned. A child is born into this world full of love and inclusion. We teach them discrimination. We teach them racism. We teach them they can't be the elected official, or they can't be what they want to be, that they have to fill this box. So yes, society has a role, but even within our cultures and within our homes, we have a role. And we really do need to do it. My parents, my mom, I love her to death, but always wanted me to get married as a good Indo-Canadian girl. Wanted me to stay out of politics, but here I am in the heart of politics and not married. And she's still proud of me and she still loves me. And I think that's where those conversations have to go beyond. But I think also like just, anti-oppression training, diversity and inclusion training, applying the GBA lens. And to the earlier comments, I agree entirely. Diversity is not a single unit. It's not a monolith. There's a diversity within diversity of perspectives, of experiences, and the list goes on. So actually taking the time to peel that back and understand, and then we won't get into tokenizing. But I think we also have to give this society a chance to look inwards and see what their decision-making table looks like, because I think most people have not taken the time to look at that they're actually perpetuating the problem rather than being part of the solution. So let's empower and encourage them to actually be part of the solution to build that truly inclusive Canada that I'm hearing we all desire.
All right, Nikki, your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Now, it's all been really powerful. And I think I was reflecting on some of the comments that how we've changed since the language of multiculturalism. And I can definitely say, as a woman of color, I have more words for racism that I'm experiencing. And I think a lot of the population does, to see and understand how it's playing out. And those are important conversations. And I just feel so adamant that we have to take up as much space as possible with the anti-racism dialogue. We just have to take up that space in every place we are, because the forces of racism are so powerful and they constantly will be pushing back and constantly wanting to keep power structures the way they are. So I'm just so inspired by all the leaders that I'm with today on this panel, including yourself, Sophie, like with the work that you're doing, just as a strong leader and what you represent to lots of people. We have to take up the space, and we can't be shy about it, and we have to be loud about it. And I think that that's the effort of anti-racism work. And I really enjoyed listening to all the perspectives today, and I feel a lot of solidarity with everybody. So thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Nadine, you talked about something that I think is really important too, having a more complex view or a more complex thought process when it comes to race, because as you said, being a woman of color is very different from being a disabled woman of color or being a poor woman of color. It's the experiences, the lived experiences are going to be different, and the systems that you have to work through are going to be different as well, and the obstacles you face are so different. And you're muted. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I think that when we say that, I'm an able-bodied woman of color, so I think owning that position of privilege is also really important too. But overall, I mean, I guess like what I would also like to say is that I would invite people to be in solidarity with people who are in leadership positions, because often, especially I would say Black, Indigenous, and women of color are hated when they speak out about racism. I've seen, Nikki and Katrina Chen and Bowinn just be attacked for naming racism as a factor in our society. And I think people with more privilege need to stand in front of that as well and not step back on it. So I think that that's really important. But, overall, I think anti-racism is about actions. It's not, there's a lot of focus on educating people about it. And while I think that's absolutely true, we are all people in policy-making positions. Dr. Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book, How to Be Anti-Racist, talks a lot about the fact that you need to lead with policy and education follows. And if we actually lift everybody up and create a more equitable world, there will be less pushback against that it's not as scary once those policies are in place. So again, yes, I think that there is a role for education and bringing people along. And there's also a place for leading with absolutely bold and radical policy. And I look forward to seeing all of that from all levels of government, because we are in decision-making positions, and the decisions we make impact people right now.
So what are the actions that you can take at the municipal level? Because as I said earlier, each level of government has sort of a different different road to travel in their policy making. Where are municipalities when it comes to anti-racism measures?
Yeah, I think looking internally is a big one. So the City of New West is doing that diversity, equity, and inclusion, and explicitly anti-racism work so that our staff have that lens. The way that we do public engagement centers a certain type of person, and that is a white male homeowner who is traditionally the people who come to City Council. So changing the way we do public engagement, including translation and services in other languages. And zoning policy, frankly, is based off racist policy. I mean, it's land use on unceded territory, but there's also issues around redlining, who got services, who's allowed to live in neighborhoods. So zoning policy has huge links to racism as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and perhaps I'll just go to Bardish and Nikki for final thoughts on how your levels of government can take specific actions when it comes to solidarity among racialized communities in standing up against white supremacy. Bardish?
So I would just say that our government, the PM's been crystal clear on calling it out. First opportunity to say systemic racism and discrimination exists in our institutions, every segment of society, every corner of society. He got called out for it a little bit, but it's okay. We doubled down and we put more resources in to say we have to do something about it. I'm one of 37 voices around the cabinet table that are actually building a more consciously inclusive Canada. And we have actually put more money into the Anti-Racism Secretariat, which actually works with all federal departments and agencies. So even if the government changes, we have actually put a thread into the DNA to make sure that we are more conscious in the way that we're building. And I think that's where it's about lasting change, because it's taken us a long time to get here. And we're going to have to dismantle, and I like that word, Nikki, dismantle our institutions and really look at what's working and not working. So a committed partner in the federal government, no matter what it takes, to make sure every Canadian has a fair chance at success under the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, for sure.
And finally, Nikki, at a provincial level, you know, the focus obviously of this discussion this morning is anti-Asian racism, but how do we show solidarity? Because as I said off the top, racism against one group is racism against all of us. It hurts our whole society.
Well, I go back to my earlier comments that government has the most important role in society to play on this, because as a provincial government, we influence so many things, whether it's child welfare in the province, whether it's policing, whether it's, you know, we can go through the healthcare where there's a report on that. We can go through so many things that we have power to influence when it comes to how racist systems impact. So it really is, and our government has looked at it as anti-racism is every minister's work. It really is every minister's work. It's every elected official's work. And it's not going to be easy because we have 150 years of things embedded in systems, right? But it's going to take time. And I think that the more people are continually putting pressure on their government to answer the call of changing systems, the better we're going to be at doing it. And you know, I have a lot of hope, and Rachna wakes up every day thinking about how we can do better as Parliamentary Secretary. So yeah.
Thank you all very much for talking about this. And my apologies if you heard the sirens outside my home. I muted myself once I heard them. All right, I want to thank all of our panelists for taking part in our conversation this morning. And now that they've shared their responses to the 3 discussion questions, I'd now like to ask that they each briefly share about 2.5 minutes of final thoughts. I'm trying to think about how I'm going to give you a time cue, but just sort of think of 2.5 minutes. Maybe I'll give you I'll raise my hand when you have about 30 seconds left. So final thoughts, especially around one thing you learned from the panel discussion today, and one commitment you are making to fostering transformative change moving forward, and how you'll hold yourself accountable. Let's go back to the beginning. We will start with Minister Mary Ng. Minister?
Well, thank you for this. I don't know how to do this in 2 minutes, but I'm going to try. I thought this was really, really excellent. And the reason I thought it was really excellent is because in each of the questions, it's very clear that that all of the leaders that are here are very committed to addressing the issue of anti-Asian racism, but racism generally. And really, if I and I don't want to put words in everyone's mouth, but it feels like to me that that not only are we committed to it, but that we're actually committed to the next thing. And the next thing is really where it is about collaborating and with a bit of laser focus on how we can, address anti-Asian racism and all forms of racism. And I guess maybe the focus I would say in all of this, and the challenge for all of us is to be able to work on the more medium and long term, but to also don't forget it's really about people right now. And what can we do, and what can we do together, which really can focus on that people. And I think that it is, I think to Nikki's point, I mean, when people are able to line up with support and their voices, it's because we've created that space to doing that. And I believe that we actually need to create that space together. And listening to all of the very good interventions, we're on the right track. And thank you so much to S.U.C.C.E.S.S for being so incredibly smart and thoughtful for bringing these voices. And I'm very confident that there are more than ours that are here, but let's build that coalition in a way that gets us to some of the immediate work, but also on a track for the future.
All right, thanks very much for that, Minister Ng. We'll move on to Parliamentary Secretary Rachna Singh. Rachna?
Thank you so much. And I would really like to thank all the panelists. It's like really important conversation, really good conversation. And I've learned a lot as well. And some themes that have come out, which are very important. And Nadine talked about the intersectionality. We cannot just look at all racialized people or all indigenous people or all Black people are being treated the same way. Intersectionality plays a big role in that. And a lot of us, and most of us who are sitting here, we are in a position of privilege. We have a voice that we can raise, and it is important that we give voice to the people who are oppressed. Dismantling the system, it will take time. We don't have a magic bullet. And this is what I always try to say whenever I'm doing any kind of round table. Yes, we are bringing a lot of changes. We are talking about bringing a legislation about disaggregated data, which was also talked about today. It is important to see where the barriers are and how to fill in those barriers and gaps. It's very important. But even when we create the anti-racism legislation, which is in my mandate, which will be coming in next 2 to 3 years, I always say one thing, that this is not a magic bullet, that even when we create that, not suddenly, like I'll wake up in the morning and the racism has gone away. It's a continuous process. It is the struggles that people have done, the advocacy people have done to bring us to this point. And racism shows in different ways. Today, we are talking about anti-Asian hate crimes or racism, but it will, anytime a crisis will come, racism will come to the front, in the forefront, as we saw with 9/11, with the Islamophobia that we are seeing all over the globe. So it is our duty, with the privilege that we have, to talk about bigotry, racism at every opportunity that we can, and to combat it, to, as I said in the beginning as well, not to be a silent bystander, giving people the capacity to talk about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Rachna. Next up, we would like to invite back to the microphone, Councillor Nadine Nakagawa. Nadine?
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's a really honor to be here with everyone today. Yeah, I mean, I really liked what Bowinn talked about the ways that we hide away from action, right? Like the shields that we put up to avoid actually talking about anti-racism. And the fact is that anti-racism is work and action. There's no such thing as being anti-racist as just an identity point. So the proof is in the pudding. It's what we're constantly doing. And the way that I hold myself accountable is by continuing to talk about people's different identity and the complexity of identity, even when it is uncomfortable. And also I share like a learning list on my website. So if anyone wants to learn with me, they want to share resources with me. I was asked before, how do city councillors learn outside of the reports that come to them? I thought it really depends on the city councillor. And so I am committed to ongoing learning and work on this, as I think we all are. But again, we are only anti-racist if we act that way. So if we bring in policies that uphold systems of power and privilege, then that is not being anti-racist. So yeah, look forward to working with everybody and continuing this conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Nadine. Moving on now to Senator Yuen Wu. Senator Wu?
Yes, thank you. Well, I would say two things. The first, picking up on the theme of all of us being in privileged positions to use our privilege and our authorities to champion those who might be overlooked because of their racial and ethnic and national backgrounds. And I'm not just talking about people around this table who generally have been in Canada for a long time or second or third generation Asian Canadians, but particularly new immigrants, people who have unorthodox backgrounds, who have strong accents, who look a little bit different and dress a little bit different and just seem a little bit awkward in Canadian society. They often come highly qualified. We need to champion them. The second thing I would say is that we also have to work very hard to challenge and refute the false narratives that are triggering the current wave in anti-Asian racism. There's a lot of bad information out there, and unfortunately, it's not propagated by racists. It's propagated by mainstream people, by politicians, by media, by commentators. The idea, for example, that housing unaffordability is because of foreigners has created racism against Chinese people. The idea, for example, that money laundering is a Chinese problem has precipitated racism against Chinese people. These are untrue. And we have to have the courage to challenge mainstream opinions that are in fact precipitating racism. This is a very difficult thing to do. But if we don't address it, we will always see spikes in racism because the latent sentiment is just waiting for the trigger. When it comes, it will rise. We have to fight against it.
All right. Thank you very much, Senator Wu. Next up, we'll go to Hedy Fry. Hedy?
Thank you, Sophie. I want to reiterate what Senator Wu said. I won't repeat it, but I think it's very important as we talk, and we know the dialogue is important. We have to start acting. Talk is great. It makes everybody walk away feeling very good about themselves, that they care and that they understand the problem or that whatever. I think we need to develop a strong action plan. I think 3 levels of government have to begin to build a relationship, as Bardish said, and work together to change it. It's not one level of government only. I also think that we need to focus very clearly on education, not just education in the schools, but public education programs. We need to go out there and put out messages to the public so that they can understand the reality. I think the last thing we need to do is to do institutional change, to make to train our police to understand this issue, to train our judiciary, to train, to make sure that the institutions are welcoming. That, I mean, when I was the minister, we did that to an extent. That's why we have Sikhs wearing turbans in the military. That's why we have Muslim women who have an ability to wear their head covering that works for the job they're doing in the military. I think we need to, as somebody said, break down the old structures, but we need to do more than talk. We need to actually look at institutional change, at public education, at educating institutions, at educating the public, educating in schools. And because we can't do it as a federal government, we got to work with the provinces to build curricula and to look at how we do that carefully so that we can create a sense that every one of us belong here, that every one of us built this nation over the years and are going to be beneficial to building a strong nation, giving everybody a place at the table. And that is, at the end, for me, is what the objective is about, letting everyone have that ability to participate fully, finding out what the challenges are, and governments have the tools, good public policy, to be able to help people to shift and move, to take those tools to help them to achieve whatever their full potential is in this society. And that is a benefit to all of us. And that message has to be very, very clear. Tolerance, I'm telling you, as a physician, it means you're tolerating pain. You know, oh my God, I'm going to try and tolerate. Respect builds a nation. Respect builds a society. Thanks.
Thank you, Hedy. Next up, I'd like to pass it over to Councillor Steve Kim. Steve?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, what an experience today. I've learned a lot. And, one thing that kind of stuck with me was on the topic of the modern multiculturalism and how it relates to anti-Asian racism and also education. And part of this, it got me thinking, is how do we challenge ourselves to understand what maybe a modern Canadian identity is? I think about when my parents came from Korea in the late 60s, there was no access back to the home country. There was no media sources. But today, in this information age, our newcomers are coming and have access back to their home countries. And how does that dynamic set up in our local communities where suddenly the need to learn English or another language is less? So I'm kind of challenged here to really see what this new era will look like, knowing that some of these root causes of anti-Asian racism or hate may be rooted in that way. So I'm committed to exploring what this the root causes are and how we can create the right actions from it. I also commit to taking all this today and the learnings back to my city and my colleagues, and so that we can have the discussions and think about the actions from all the information, the great information that I got here today. So thank you, everyone. I will end on one last thing because I didn't see a finger yet.
Nope.
I love our nation. And I was born and raised in Greater Vancouver, and I love our province and our area. But time and time again, hate and anti-Asian racism has popped its ugly head. So I really do think the time is now for us to do something, to see this as an investment for our future, so that we can really make the change to the fabric of our society. So I'm committed to work here. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. Next up, we will go to Parliamentary Secretary Nikki Sharma. Nikki?
Thank you. I just want to start by thanking S.U.C.C.E.S.S and all the people that organized this and such a great, powerful panel. I think what's clear today is that we all have a lot of passion and a lot of ideas, but my commitment, and I think the commitment of everybody here, is that we won't relent, that the 150 years plus of struggle that our parents, our grandparents, our people coming and establishing and pushing back on systems that work against them in this province will continue with us, that we won't take up, we won't let racism take up and grow and spread. And every time I see it, I'll name it, I'll use whatever systems and power that I have to make it better for those voices of people that can't. And I'm hopeful that with all of us working together in solidarity, that we can see progress. And I just want to thank everybody for all of their passion and ideas today.
All right. Thank you so much, Nikki. Now we will move on to Minister Bowinn Ma. Bowinn?
Thank you so much. Rachna said earlier that crises exacerbate fear and blame and finger pointing, and it can be easier to blame the other than it is to face the issues that we are facing head on. And that's what we're seeing here in this pandemic. But it also means that there will eventually be a time, and sorry, that's my phone, another spam call. There will be hopefully a time when we are no longer in a crisis mode, where some of these issues may go back underground. And it's incredibly important that we've seized this space now to have conversations on this and not allow for this conversation to kind of disappear into the ether. And I really appreciated what Nadine said about action and some of the examples that she gave on actual government action that is anti-racist. And what strikes me is that those actions are not always obviously anti-racist. We often talk about anti-racism as though we're dealing with that specific issue head on. A lot of the actions that we can take as government are not always obvious. As a Minister of State for Infrastructure, I was having a conversation with a colleague who represented a riding further north in a much rural area, and I was asking her about active transportation. What is active transportation, and what do trails mean to your community? Are they important? Everyone's got a car out there. And she said to me, yes, everybody has a car, or almost everyone has a car out here. But you know who doesn't have a car? People who are in poverty. people with disabilities, people who are seniors, and in particular, lots of people who are in poverty were Indigenous people. And she described seeing an Indigenous mother pushing her baby in a stroller along the lane of a highway to get between two Indigenous communities, because that was the only way she could travel. And so what does anti-racist policymaking mean in transportation? It could very well mean safe, active transportation pathways in communities that are actually very car dominant, because you don't see the people who cannot afford to operate those cars. And the last thing I want to say and close off with here is that this discussion today has been absolutely fantastic, and I've learned so much. And I love that we're hearing from people of color, and I think that's incredibly important. But oftentimes, even people of color who have managed to get themselves into these systems of power are not often at the head of power within the systems themselves. And I know that we all have non-racialized colleagues who are fantastic allies. But my question is, what would this conversation sound like if our white colleagues were participating? And that may be one of the biggest measures of whether we're actually succeeding in moving this dial forward. And maybe we should test that out in a year or two.
Absolutely. All right, thank you for that, Bowinn. Our final panelist, Minister Bardish Chagger. Bardish?
Thank you so much. So what did I learn? I actually learned that if you want to run an event of this caliber and size, you need Sophie to run it. So it's amazing to be with you and keeping us on track. A massive kudos to S.U.C.C.E.S.S and Queenie and the entire team that has put this together to kick off Asian Heritage Month. These are the kind of fruitful conversations we need to have, and I like the respectful dialogue while also pushing each other. So yes, let's celebrate the contributions that so many diverse communities, including Asians, Canadians of Asian descent, have made, but also let's expose and confront the realities that Canadians of Asian descent continue to face. And I think that is part of it. And I think, you know, yes, within the public sphere, but also within ourselves. I always share the story about my grandfather and just the reality of what he had to face when he first moved into this community and obtaining a job. And oftentimes my family will say, like, why do you share that? I share that because it's real, because it's true, and because people continue to face it. So as hard as it is for my family to have to confront just that was a reality of us getting to where we are today, we've not hit the goal of true equality. We still need to make sure we keep pushing, but we have to reward the progress we've made. So I think it's important to confront those realities and expose those realities and call them out, but we also need people to know the contributions we've made. And I think it's really true that people don't know what's taken place in our history. So we have to bring that to the forefront and say, you know, unless you're Indigenous, everyone immigrated here. And if you like, you know, your railroads and you like your roads and you like so forth, you might want to thank an immigrant oftentimes. And you might want to thank Indigenous people for sharing their land. And I think it's important that we have those conversations. My commitment is really to support the mandate letter the Prime Minister has given me to ensure that we are applying the intersectional lens in all of the policies that we are advancing, and when every minister of the Crown is advancing and executing their portfolios, that diverse communities be represented. So I would just encourage you, it's the first time we had a woman finance minister since Confederation table a budget, over 700 pages, over 250 measures, and you will see that this work is being done because it's within the justice policies, it's within the public safety policies, it's within the economic opportunities, as well as the social programs, it's in environment, it's in infrastructure. So we started this work, and I look forward to working with all levels of government to continue getting us to that truly consciously inclusive Canada. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Bardish, and thank you to all of our panelists today for giving your time and being so thoughtful in your responses and in this discussion. A lot of different thoughts and ideas have been discussed here today on how we can move forward to make transformative change. Of course, we started at 10, so an hour and a half discussion is not going to change the world, but it is a good step towards making things happen. Everyone has an important role to play. Everyone needs to be united and committed to anti-racism, whether it's anti-Asian racism or any hatefulness or systemic racism toward any racialized group, whether it's individuals, governments, institutions, community, business, it involves all of us. So as we prepare to close our session, I would ask each of you attending to reflect on what you've heard today So I'm talking to not just our panelists, but everyone who's watching here today. I would ask each of you to reflect on what you commit to do moving forward, and how you will hold yourself accountable. Myself, I have really enjoyed being a part of this discussion, and I think when we hear the word racism, it's such an ugly word. It's such an it has such ugly connotations behind it, but I'm surprisingly hopeful. I'm excited to learn more. I'm excited to have these discussions. I'm excited that we're having these conversations now. And I commit to listening more, to being a part of these discussions more. These are not discussions that I had ever felt very comfortable with through most of my life growing up and as an adult, but I am definitely opening my mind more to being involved and using my own voice to speak out and using my own platform. It's a very strange place for me to be, but I think it's important that I be a part of these discussions as well. So thank you so much to S.U.C.C.E.S.S for allowing me to get involved with this today. I'd now like to pass it over to S.U.C.C.E.S.S Board Chair Terry Young and CEO Queenie Chu to close our event.
Thank you. On behalf of S.U.C.C.E.S.S, I'd like to firstly thank our panelists this morning, Ministers Chagger, Singh, and Ma, Senator Wu, MP Fry, Parliamentary Secretary Sharma and Singh, and Councillors Kim and Nakagawa. It's great to hear your insightful comments on why this difficult but important subject of racism matter, because it does matter. Fighting racism and nation hate is near and dear to so many of us here. And I also want to thank our moderator, Sophie, for strong advocacy on fighting Asian hate and for building a better and more inclusive society that we all should subscribe to. I know we do here this morning. I would also like to thank all the supporters and attendees for joining us this early Saturday morning, plus our ASL interpreters, Liz and Melanie. Thank you for supporting S.U.C.C.E.S.S. This morning's conversation gives me hope that we can and will do better. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask our CEO, Queenie, to share what to expect from S.U.C.C.E.S.S next.
Thank you, Terry. And I would also like to extend my appreciations to Sophie, Liz, Melanie, and all our amazing panelists today. I also wanted to give a shout out to the incredible work by my colleagues, Amy Chen, Ryan Drew, and Michaela Torres, who have helped organize this event. S.U.C.C.E.S.S is committed in the continued anti-racist work in the community. We acknowledge that we hold power and privileges, and we will use it responsibly to create positive changes. This includes not only our social services programming for newcomer and racialized communities, but also advocating different sectors and governments to make transformative changes as well. The continued journey of learning is a critical and ongoing part of this work. I invite everyone to attend the online anti-racism conference being convened by our Tri-City Local Immigrant Partnership from May 4th to the 21st. There will be over 20 amazing events during these weeks, including workshops, keynotes, and performances. We'll put the link in the chat box for you. S.U.C.C.E.S.S will also be organizing active witnessing bystander webinars in the weeks and months ahead. We have more initiatives planned, which will be announced soon on our website, social media, and community newsletter. Thank you again for taking the time to be here today. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you again.